I no longer dream, but I was once a hunter too. There's nothing more horrific than a hunt. In case you fail to realize, the things you hunt, they're not beasts, they're people. One day you will see. I should think you still have dreams. Well, the next time you dream, give some thought.
Oh, I didn't see you there. Hello everyone. This is Aegon of Astora. Welcome back to Bloodborne Let's Talk Lore. This is episode 3. And I was just having a scintillating conversation with the chapel dweller here. So I apologize if I had seen you standing there, I would have said hello sooner. It is Tuesday, July 21st today, on the day of recording this particular commentary. And I hope that each and every one of you out there is having a fantastic day today. The gameplay for this was recorded the same evening as episode 2, so that is, I believe, the 16th of July. And we have the lonely old deer here.
Oh no, I haven't forgotten. Do you think I owe you something? Well, that's a fine lark, I'd say. This whole mess that Yharnam's in is all your fault. You predicted outsiders. Our blood's ruined. Tainted by your ilk. Don't you come near me. I know your type. You. Stay away from me. I know all your tricks.
So we see that the lonely old deer, whom we directed here towards the end of the previous episode, we see that she's currently not in the mood for company, and certainly not in the mood to be in our company. And I think that there's at least 2 reasons for that. So that is, first, from the perspective of an everyday Yharnamite, it would seem as though the hunters, many of whom are outsiders, are doing a particularly poor job of keeping the Scourge of the Beast under control. And from the perspective of, like I said, just an everyday person, it's really difficult to, be able to tell that there's more stuff going on. We, as the player character, as the Paleblood Hunter, we have a particularly privileged perspective on some of the things that are happening, with the ability for us to piece things together. But for an everyday Yharnamite, like the lonely old deer there, she has no such luxury. So from her perspective, it's rather simple. Us hunters are not doing our job properly, and therefore she's had to upend her life and move to the Udin Chapel for the time being, until this particular night of the hunt ends. Second, and perhaps more importantly, she seems to be marked in some ways by what might be described, somewhat anachronistically of course, as Yharnamite biomedicine. So that is, as we'll learn later on, the lonely old deer is a heavy user of sedatives. And I'm having a look there, of course, at the amygdala that is invisible, and I'm going to leave that armor set there for now for reasons that will later become apparent. But As we'll learn later on, the Lonely Old Deer is a heavy user of sedatives, and it would seem that as a result of the current Night of the Hunt having started, she's been cooped up in her home and has therefore been unable to get her hands on sedatives for quite some time. So she seems to be going through a withdrawal period of some sort. That she can't get her hands on her sedatives, and so she's in a particularly foul mood. And so we can't particularly blame her for that. But we're going to return to this topic as it relates specifically to the Lonely Old Deer later on. But I'm bringing all this up because it relates very closely to our forthcoming discussion about Old Yharnam. And I'm going to be bringing some of my scholarship to bear on this issue. So I will try to keep it somewhat accessible, but at the same time, I do want to give you an idea of why it is that this game and the Souls games in general speak to me as an academic in my field of study, because I see a lot of parallels in the things being discussed, or the thematic orientation of these games and the content of my own studies. And so we come across a figure praying here, and this is of course Alfred the Executioner, but we only know him as Alfred at the very outset. And he seems to be very, very focused on his prayer.
You're a beast hunter, aren't you? I knew it. That's precisely how I started out. Oh, beg pardon. You may call me Alfred, protégé of Master Ligurius, hunter of vile bloods. So, what say you? Our prey might differ, but we are hunters, the both of us. Why not cooperate and discuss the things we've learned? Oh, very good. Very good indeed. Take this to celebrate our acquaintance. Beast hunting is a sacred practice. May the good blood guide your way. There must be oodles for us to share. Go on, just tell me what piques your interest. As you know, the Healing Church is the fountainhead of blood healing. Well, I'm a simple hunter, quite unfamiliar with the ins and outs of the institution. But I have heard that the holy medium of blood healing is venerated in the main cathedral, and that counselors of the old church reside in the high stratum of the cathedral ward. If you seek blood healing, and the church is willing, you should pay them a visit. Byrgenwerth is an old place of learning, and the tomb of the gods, carved out below Yharnam, should be familiar to every hunter. Well, once a group of young Byrgenwerth scholars discovered a holy medium deep within the tomb. This led to the founding of the Healing Church and the establishment of blood healing. In this sense, everything sacred in Yharnam can be traced back to Byrgenwerth. But today, the college lies deep within a tangled wood, abandoned and decrepit. And furthermore, the Healing Church has declared Byrgenwerth forbidden ground. It's unclear how many of its scholars remain alive, but only they know the password that allows passage through the gate. I bid you farewell. It has been a pleasure. May the good blood guide your way.
So Alfred's provided us with a lot of really, really important information, and while we'll be discussing Alfred himself at a later date, we will take some time now to discuss some of the more important clues he's given us. And you can see here I was angling the camera so that you can see that he actually has a hunter's mark embroidered or faded into the chest piece of his Executioner set. So something that's interesting that I hadn't noticed until I did this recording. But he gave us some fire paper, so let's check that out. Coarse paper that applies fire to weapons when rubbed. A hunter tool found in the Healing Church workshop. Since the tragedy that struck Old Yharnam, fire has become a staple in beast hunts and is thought to cleanse impurity. Certain types of beasts have an abnormal fear of flame. In the previous episode, we also picked up the Odin tomb key, which we didn't read, so let's check it out. Key to the gate that blocks the tomb of Odin. Beyond the tomb, Odin Chapel can be found in the center of the cathedral ward. Only today, the church is abandoned, and some say the residents of Odin have all gone mad. So it's also interesting to note that the Hunter hat and the Yharnam Hunter hat are very distinct in that the Hunter hat actually provides decent defense, or stable defense, as it says, to anyone facing Yharnam's beastly threat, whereas the Yharnam Hunter cap doesn't provide a commensurate level of defense. And so this hints at something that Alfred brought up, which we're going to discuss now, and that is he hinted at something that Redgrave calls the Byrgenwerth schism. So first he mentions that a group of young Byrgenwerth scholars went to explore the Tomb of the Gods, that is to say the underground labyrinth, or what we know now as the Chalice Dungeons. There, these young scholars discovered what Alfred calls a holy medium, a finding which then led to the foundation of the Healing Church and the establishment of blood healing. So this diagram shows us that we're starting to piece together the story a little bit, but we're still missing some really crucial pieces of information. So as we come to those tidbits throughout the rest of the playthrough, we'll return to that diagram and we'll modify it and add to it as needed so that we get a fuller picture of what it is that is exactly going on. And so it was the foundation of blood healing and the establishment of Healing Church, which of course served as the source of the Byrgenwerth schism. And for anyone who is familiar with the story of the Halo games, in particular the early story, because I haven't really paid much attention to it since 343 Industries took over, but that's a story for another day. But the distinction between the hunters of Gehrman and the hunters of Ludwig reminds me very much of the distinction that's drawn in those games between the Spartan 2s and the Spartan 3s. Whereas the Spartan 2s were a very select group, outfitted very well. Spartan 3s were essentially kids dressed up to go on suicide missions. But we're about to pick up a very, very crucial piece of lore in the form of these antidotes. Small medicinal tablets that counteract poison, used to treat ashen blood, the baffling sickness that ravaged old Yharnam long ago. These tablets only provide short-term relief. The ashen blood ailment eventually triggered the spread of the beastly scourge. So this item description, as Redgrave points out in his Paleblood hunt, is among the more important in the game because it really provides a link between the past and the present, and what happened in Yharnam that led to the Scourge of the Beast. And it links together as well what I was describing before, and that is the biomedical establishment of Yharnam, which began in what Alfred describes as the Tomb of the Gods with the discovery of a holy medium. And we picked up some pungent blood cocktail. Mature blood cocktail that releases a pungent odor when thrown that attracts bloodthirsty beasts. A precious tool in sadly short supply. In Yharnam, they produce more blood than alcohol, as the former is more intoxicating. It was around this point that I realized, wait a second, I don't have the monocle. Or the monocular, pardon me. And that's something that we're going to need for this area. So I decided, alright, might as well head back and go and grab that real quick. But yeah, so in returning to the topic of biomedicine, I mentioned earlier that it would be anachronistic to use the term biomedicine to apply to Yharnam, but I'm going to be doing that anyway, simply because, as I mentioned, part of what makes these games so very interesting to me is the linkages that I find, or the thematic similarities I find between my studies and the, themes that are presented in this game. And one of the themes that seems to be particularly evident throughout Bloodborne is the theme of biomedical hubris. In Yharnam, as in our day, the biomedical establishment has a certain hubris about it, whereby their success and knowledge is overstated, while their failures and the extent of their uncertainty are downplayed, or in some cases ignored on a systemic institutional level. There are, of course, good reasons for this, and before I go on, I want to make clear that if there are any medical professionals out there watching this, or indeed any individuals who rely heavily on the care of such professionals, I'm not casting aspersions on any of you. I rely, like almost everyone else, on the institutions of modern biomedicine for a great many things. At the same time, there are some very real, very fundamental problems with the ways in which biomedicine operates on an institutional level. And I've had a very hard time in semesters past trying to convey the following to some of my students, so let's see if I can do any better with that here. This 17th century illustration, for example, provides a striking demonstration of one of the most fundamental issues with modern biomedicine. That is, it conceives of the human body in mechanical terms. For this reason, when you visit a doctor to complain about a particular ailment, it is the ailment itself or the part of the body the ailment is affecting that the doctor will focus on. This is, once again, not to cast aspersions on any individual medical professional, rather an observation about the way the system is structured. In Canada, for instance, many of the provincial medical insurance systems are structured around the treatment of body parts. That is to say that if you go to a doctor with a knee problem, that doctor will be reimbursed by the public insurance system in Canada at the going rate for whatever knee treatment was administered. In other words, despite overwhelming evidence to the contrary, we are conceived of by the biomedical establishment not as human beings, not as the sum of countless interacting complex assemblages of bio things, but as a collection of potentially profitable body parts. Each of these body parts are thought to operate independently of the others, just as they might if we were, in fact, machines. In short, we are still seen incorrectly, by the Western biomedical sciences in particular, as mechanical beings, not all that dissimilar to how we were seen during the Enlightenment. And I promise I am going somewhere with this, and it will relate back to what you're seeing on screen, but perhaps it is this misconception of us as machines that led to the next two misconceptions I want to talk about. First, the idea that because a condition or disease is in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, or the DSM for short, that said condition or disease is well defined and understood. And on a related note, second, the idea that pharmaceuticals specifically target the parts of the body, microscopic or otherwise, which give rise to these conditions. While, to be sure, in some cases this is true, in many cases it's not. And to reiterate one more time, biomedicine has saved countless lives, yes, but that doesn't mean it should be insulated from critical analysis. With that said, I'm going to give you a brief personal example, and then we'll finally relate it back to what you're seeing on screen. When I was a teenager, I had really, really bad acne, so I was prescribed one medication after the next, and nothing worked. But then I was put on a drug called Accutane, a treatment of last resort, as it was described to me at the time, and it felt like one too. Once I was on the meds, I had to go to the hospital every week for 3 months to have my liver functioning tested. And by the time I was off the meds, the acne was almost entirely gone. It seemed like it was a miracle. But then came the side effects. The worst part is the dryness. Even to this day, 15 years later, I have to use lubricating eye drops constantly, or else my eyes drop to the point where it can affect my vision. And here we come across the same door that we mentioned in the previous episode, that Illusory Wall used some shining coins to demonstrate that it was in fact the same door that's on the Great Bridge. So on the other side of that door actually lies the Great Bridge, the boss room where we fought the Cleric Beast. So the Accutane rid me of most of my acne, but did so only by drying up the rest of my face. It didn't directly target the acne, it just did it by brute force. And so in this way, I'm marked by biomedicine, a science that claims to be highly precise, but in many cases is not. And I'm not complaining about this, because it was a trade-off that, me as a teenager and my family, we talked about and figured out, but it's just something I'm pointing out, that I'm marked by biomedicine. I'm not saying it's a bad thing, I'm not saying it's a good thing, I'm just pointing that out. You know who else is marked by biomedicine? The lonely old deer. In her case, not necessarily good, not necessarily bad, because it's helping her cope with things. But you know who's really marked by biomedicine in a way that is objectively bad? The citizens of Old Yharnam. So we find ourselves back in Old Yharnam, but now with our monocular in hand. So we'll be able to do quite a bit of sightseeing before we actually get on with the level. I tried using the monocular to see if you could make out anything that's written on this sign to see if it might indicate something different than is actually said in the dialogue. This town is long abandoned, hunters not wanted here. It's very obvious who actually wrote it, but I guess I'll let him introduce himself. I tried throughout this to try and get a good shot of what he looks like while sitting at that chain gun, but I wasn't entirely successful.
You there? Hunter! Didn't you see the warning? Turn back at once. Old Yharnam, burned and abandoned by men, is now home only to beasts. They are of no harm to those alive. Turn back, or the hunter will face the hunt.
That still gives me goosebumps just about every time I walk in here. This is possibly my favorite area in any of the Souls games. Not necessarily for gameplay reasons, and you can see, once again, just this institutionalized cruelty of the beast, who, if we're to believe Jura, if we are to share his philosophical outlook on things, that they too are people, just like everyone else. I agree very much with Jura, and for that reason we are not going to harm any of the beasts of Yharnam, not a single one. Now, of course, it needs to be said that the citizens of Old Yharnam are marked by biomedicine in a rather extreme and exceptional manner. But with that said, there still exists remarkable parallels between the story of Old Yharnam and those that I've come across over the course of my research. But before I go into that, I wanted to read something that Hidetaka Miyazaki said while being interviewed by Future Press for the official guide. When asked which of the various locations in the game correspond to what we call reality, Miyazaki responded that, quote, "Yharnam at night with the hunters and all truly is a nightmare-like world. But is it actually a nightmare? Or was it? I think different gamers will have different interpretations of that. That's something deliberate on our part. I like reading about how gamers interpret or think about the story and world of my games, so I don't want to rob them of that space for open interpretation." So that's something I think should be kept in mind going forward, that I will be speculating a fair bit throughout the course of this playthrough. I just thought it should be noted that this is something that Miyazaki wants. He wants us to speculate, and he purposely leaves it open to interpretation, and he allows us to come up with our own stories, and that's what we're going to do here. And in this moment I decided this is going to be the thumbnail shot for this particular episode. So I turned off the HUD and took a screenshot. And you can see here, it's kind of hard. It looks like he has a chair and he's sitting down. Of course, when we go up there, we don't see any such seating apparatus. So what exactly happened in Old Yharnam? It would seem that, as we just learned from the antidote item description, a disease referred to as the Ashen Blood started spreading across Old Yharnam, which to me, speculation, seems very much to be a slum of sorts.
You are a skilled hunter, adept, merciless, half-cut with blood, as the best hunters are. Which is why I must stop you.
So you can see here I'm trying my very, very best to not hurt any of the beasts of Old Yharnam. And inside of that chest is just a blood gem, so I'm going to grab all of the items except for that blood gem, and we're not necessarily going to talk about all of them right at this very moment, simply because I spend a lot of time here doing crowd control and trying to keep the beasts on the lower levels so that I don't have to fight them. But Ashen Blood came to Old Yharnam. How or why that happened, I don't believe is entirely clear, but whatever the case, the Healing Church came along with their new holy medium that they discovered in the old underground labyrinth. And we'll get into specifically what that is later, but the red moon hangs low, and beasts rule the streets. are we left with no other choice than to burn it all to cinders? I think, again, speculation, that it was Jura who left that note, while he was working with or alongside the powder kegs, who were contracted to essentially stop the spread of the scourge in Old Yharnam. And here we pick up a Charred Hunter set, which we'll read the item description for a bit later, but I wanted to point out that you can see some of these beasts. There's a large beast that seems to be a paternal figure, and a series of younger, smaller beasts that seem to follow that beast around, almost as if it's their children. So again, as Jura has pointed out, these are people, or as he will have pointed out later on, these are people, or they at least once were people, and they exist in families, they're children, they're adults, and yeah, so they shouldn't be so cold-heartedly slaughtered in the way that the Healing Church seems to have taken to in the Ludwig era. So the Healing Church came along with its holy medium, which gave way to blood healing, blood ministration. Blood was ministered to the citizens of Old Yharnam, and eventually it would seem that there were either interactions of some sort between the antidote and the blood ministration, or the blood ministration activated some sort of disease that was latent in the ashen blood, but whatever the case, it triggered this spread of the beastly scourge. And so it seems very much to be a classic case of biomedical hubris, whereby there's a new treatment that's developed, and rather than testing it appropriately or for a long enough period of time, biomedicine fails to ultimately self-reflect, and tied together with the interests of other political groups, winds up releasing a treatment or administering a treatment which has unintended side effects. So whereas in my case I just merely have to use eye drops multiple times a day, the citizens of Old Yharnam were all turned into beasts. And up to that point, the Healing Church Workshop had operated in secret under Gehrman. They were an elite force, again like the Spartan 2s in Halo, and with the transition to Ludwig, they were recruited en masse to try and stop the scourge of the beast. And it's really a brilliant political maneuver that has been used time and again to kind of change the channel on what it is that happened. Here was the Healing Church, ascendant in terms of its political and social power. They were curing all these people with this miraculous blood that they found in these tombs, and they could essentially do no wrong. Then came Ashen Blood at Old Yharnam, a devastating condition in what seems, speculation, to be a very poor slum. And they come along with a magical, albeit untested cure to solve everyone's problems. And this is something that still happens in our day, with pharmaceutical companies being subjected to ethics legislation, which restricts their ability to use humans or animals as test subjects. So what have they done in response to that? They go to poor countries and they offer the people in these poor countries who are suffering from these ailments, they offer them these drug trials and they pay them a certain amount of money, and they're essentially exploited, these indigenous populations, by these pharmaceutical companies who make enormous profits. But that's an aside. The point I'm trying to make is that Old Yharnam very much fits that bill. And more than that, Old Yharnam stands as a perfect example of the unintended consequences of biomedicine, but also how political interests are very thoroughly intertwined with those of the biomedical establishment, whether in Old Yharnam or in our world. So as Redgrave argues in the Paleblood Hunt, it was after this that the workshop hunters could no longer operate in secret. The unintended consequences of the old blood treatment of blood ministration was becoming much more widely known because, a huge slum, a huge part of the city of Yharnam has essentially fallen to the beast, and the beast rule the streets. Are we left with no other choice than to burn it to cinders? And I really like that mechanic of that note that we found, that it's not clear whether it's supposed to be a developer note or anything else. I firmly believe that it was Jura who wrote that note. and he was, stuck in a corner in that building with whomever else that person was there. And maybe he turned on that person. Maybe, as Redgrave posits, he participated willingly in the cleansing of Old Yharnam. This is something that I think is a lot more clear than it's otherwise made out to be, generally. But I think that it would be rather inconsistent with Jura, as we know him as a character, for him to have participated willingly in the cleansing of Old Yharnam. I think that he did what he needed to do to fulfill his contract, which may or may not have been slaying Murgo, but it seems almost as though his contract was merely to stop the spread of the scourge in Old Yharnam. And I was rather disappointed here because I wanted really badly to summon Alfred the Executioner. And you can see his summon sign right there. Well, it's not exactly a summon sign, it's a note. But when you stand right there and you ring the bell, you can summon him. But I wanted that beast to go away because obviously I'm trying not to harm any of the beasts save for the Bloodstarved Beast. But he was stuck in kind of an aggro chain loop. So I was going to walk over there and try to summon Alfred, and I wanted to be very careful about it as well because the NPC summons in this game, they are incredibly aggressive, and even if they don't necessarily see an enemy, if they detect one in their vicinity, they run after it. They go in there headlong, and there are a few beasts sleeping seemingly on the grass out there, and I didn't want them to be harmed. But it is very, very interesting to note that once again, with Alfred the Executioner, he has a small resonant bell. And I wanted to talk a little bit about him having it and about what he said earlier with respect to him having gotten started with beast hunting as well. So I was wondering what each of you guys thought about the possibility that Alfred may have at one point been a Paleblood hunter himself. I'm very doubtful on that, but I suppose we'll see. So as you can probably see, I am not doing well here. I've always done well with this fight when playing Unlocked and simply staying behind its rear left leg, but for some reason I always seem to regress into spam the parry button mode, and I wind up getting obliterated as a result. I've heard many people say that it's incredibly easy to parry the Bloodstarved Beast, but for some reason I always seem to struggle with it. So, spoiler alert, but I die at the end of this fight, which is why I'm talking right now, because it's also a very long fight. So we might as well use this opportunity to recap all that we've discussed so far, because I know I've taken this conversation in a number of seemingly unrelated directions. So we'll try to simplify things a little bit. Keep in mind that this isn't necessarily a timeline, so the sequence of events as follows may not be entirely accurate, based as it is on the information we have on hand right now, together with my own speculation. First, a group of young scholars from Byrgenwerth set out to explore the Tomb of the Gods. Second, they discovered there a holy medium, which led to the formation of the Healing Church and the establishment of blood healing. Third, the Ashen Blood disease emerges or re-emerges and spreads throughout the slums of what we now know as Old Yharnam. Fourth, the citizens of Old Yharnam are given antidote tablets as a means of managing the symptoms of the Ashen Blood disease. Fifth, the Healing Church, now ascendant as a religious, scientific, and political entity, initiated a blood administration treatment program on a massive scale in Old Yharnam. Sixth, what happened next was aptly summarized by Redgrave in his Paleblood Hunt, and he writes, quote, "One disease, that is the Ashen Blood, had been contained, but the treatment gave birth to the scourge. Why this happened, though, is a matter of speculation. Perhaps it arose out of the interactions of the Old Blood and the Ashen Blood, maybe it was used in excess. Whatever the case, the mass treatment program initiated by the Healing Church seems to have catalyzed or accelerated the spreading scourge, rather than halting it altogether. Seventh, the Healing Church, at a certain point, deemed Old Yharnam a lost city, and sought to quarantine the spread of the scourge by exterminating its inhabitants. Eighth, it was somewhere around this time that Jura awoke in the Hunter's dream, reborn in a way, as a Paleblood hunter. When he came across Old Yharnam, he not only made contact with the powder kegs, which we will discuss later, but he also became attuned to the plight of the citizens of Old Yharnam. After he fulfilled his contract, whatever that might be, he opted to become severed from the dream, submitting to Gehrman and dedicating the remainder of his now mortal life to protecting, from his perspective, the people of Old Yharnam. Ninth, in the aftermath of the tragedy at Old Yharnam, the Scourge of the Beast could no longer be kept a secret. Thus, Ludwig initiated a shift in the Healing Church's strategy, whereby the idea of an elite secret police force, represented by the Hunters of the Workshop, was abandoned in favor of arming the population, creating what quite literally became angry, pitchfork-holding mobs. These citizens were poorly outfitted to battle the beasts, and in this way could be seen as analogous to the Spartan 3s from the Halo universe, who were also poorly trained and outfitted and sent on suicide missions, in stark contrast to the highly trained elite Spartan 2s that came before them. In this way, Ludwig was incredibly successful in having changed the channel on the controversy that should have arose as a result of the tragedy at Old Yharnam. In so doing, these citizens blamed not the Healing Church, whose actions brought the scourge upon the citizens of Old Yharnam. Instead, Ludwig's political maneuver manipulated the remaining citizens into blaming the victims of this tragedy. That is, the people who had been transformed into beasts as a result of having received blood ministration. So, I mentioned earlier that the political maneuver done by Ludwig and the Healing Church was something I was familiar with because of my research. And while I would love to share a detailed example, doing that would require yet another lengthy diversion so that I might provide some definitional clarity and so that I might also establish the appropriate context. As I've already done that once in this episode, I'll try to keep this particular example brief. The global financial crisis of the late 2000s was precipitated in no small part by the global policy convergence that took place in the preceding decades. That is, governments the world over adopted for various reasons public policies consistent with neoliberalism. What is neoliberalism? I'm going to answer this question by quoting from an unpublished manuscript of mine where I wrote, quote, "We might describe the ideology of neoliberalism as a kind of market fundamentalism, characterized by the belief that every realm of human experience should be governed by the free market. Market fundamentalists yearn for a society that demands, much like their sacred market, the creation of winners and losers in equal measure. The ideology of neoliberalism, in other words, is a roadmap to inequality, whereby the losers blame not their oppressors but themselves. The hegemony of neoliberalism leads not only to the minority rule of financial elites, but also to the institutionalizing of the cruelest forms of victim blaming." End quote. So the global financial crisis was therefore a long time in the making, precipitated by a global policy agenda which emphasized policies that sought to redistribute wealth upwards, that is, to make the rich richer. How did they get away with this? Well, by shifting the blame away from the structural problems thus created and towards those harmed most by these structures of inequality. While we might have reasonably expected in the aftermath of the global financial crisis that governments the world over would have recognized the pivotal role played by neoliberal policies in precipitating this crisis, what we've seen instead is the intensification of these policies. For example, we spent the decades leading up to the crisis cutting public spending. While there was an influx of public spending at the depths of the worldwide recession, we went right back to spending cuts a short time later. All of this is to say that just as the neoliberal project gained further legitimation when, in the aftermath of the global financial crisis, it should have been delegitimated, so too did the Healing Church find itself with more power when, in the aftermath of the crisis at Old Yharnam, it should have lost power instead. If you're interested in learning more about any of this, you can of course leave questions for me in the comment section below. I've also included a reference in the video description to a book that was written on this very subject by Colin Crouch, titled The Strange Non-Death of Neoliberalism. While I've not yet read this particular book, I've heard many good things about it, so you can check that out if you're interested. And returning, finally, to what you're actually looking at on screen, as you've just seen, I had slain the Bloodstarved Beast at the same time the Bloodstarved Beast had slain me. Thankfully, the boss kill did in fact register, and I just thought I would gander at some of the little details in the boss room, about which I don't really have all that much to say. So let's head back to the Hunter's Dream. Okay, so before I get to your comments, I just wanted to say thank you to all of you for leaving such thoughtful and insightful comments about the lore, but also for how supportive and kind each of you have been. As I've said many times, these videos are a lot of work, but it always seems worth it after I read your comments. I won't be able to get to everyone's comments in each episode, but I do hope you know how much I appreciate your comments nevertheless. So again, thank you. Connor Martin writes that the whole game seems to him like an Inception, referring presumably to the movie Inception, where you are not actually in a true world. While I don't personally subscribe to this viewpoint, as I think the lines that separate dreams, nightmares, and realities in this game are incredibly blurry, I think it's a perfectly valid viewpoint to have. And in fact, remember that Miyazaki quotation we discussed earlier? Well, Miyazaki says that he thinks different gamers will have different interpretations of that, and that this is something that he did deliberately. So again, even though I may have different ideas, that doesn't make yours any less valid or any less interesting. Koi Pop writes that while he doesn't buy the Cleric Beast as Ludwig theory, he is similarly unconvinced that Ludwig might be the Forgotten Madman we fight as a boss in the Chalice dungeons. By way of a correction, however, I'm 99% sure that the boss is named the Forgotten Madman and not, as Koi Pop suggests, the Forgotten Madmen. We'll return to this subject when we actually meet this boss in this playthrough, but for the time being, I wanted to express how very badly I want Koi Pop's idea to be true, that we might wind up meeting Ludwig in the forthcoming expansion, just as we did Artorias in the DLC for Dark Souls 1. Put simply, that would be incredible. On the subject of my argument that Bloodborne is missing a hollowing type mechanic, Dark Ideals shared with us the details of what they describe as their mental stress theory. It's a long comment, so I'm not going to quote it at length, but I would encourage each of you to check it out in the comment section of the previous episode. I will be returning to your comment when I discuss in detail my meta-narrative theory about the endings, but for now I wanted to clarify my point about the lack of a hollowing mechanic. In Dark Souls 1, you are bound to the bonfires, like essentially every other undead. Being bound to the bonfires in Dark Souls 1 does not make you special. When the player, in meta terms, dies for the last time, goes hollow, and quits playing the game, their bloodstain has a chance to show up in another player's world in the form of a vagrant. This same principle seems to apply to the NPC corpses we find around Lordran. When the NPC in question dies for the last time, goes H hollow, they transmit not a vagrant to other worlds, but items on a corpse. This may seem like a loose connection, but there is to some extent a mechanical explanation for when a player character, playable or otherwise, quits mid-journey. Whatever the case, when the player character quits, there isn't really anything lost, because almost all humans are tied to bonfires. In other words, being tied to the bonfire doesn't in and of itself make you special. In Bloodborne, on the other hand, there is something special about being bound to the Hunter's Dream. The Paleblood Hunter is chosen, for one reason or another, to carry out a very important and very specific contract. But if they are unable to carry out this contract for whatever reason, say if a Souls noob quits because they can't beat Father Gascoigne, there is no mechanical explanation for that. Maybe I'm overthinking this and I don't think I'm articulating my point very well here, so I'm going to leave it at that for now. I will say more generally that I disagree with your interpretation of what it means or doesn't mean to be a Paleblood Hunter. There are many reasons for this, but I think this bit of dialogue from Eileen,
"You still have dreams? Tell the little doll I said hello,"
is incredibly compelling in how it references the Hunter's Dream specifically by mentioning the doll. On the question of our conception of Gehrman, Dark Ideals raises an incredibly interesting theory. Dark Ideals writes that notice that Gehrman is missing one of his legs, having a peg leg instead. Also note that the old hunter's bone is a tibia bone. So the old hunter's bone would seem literally to be Gehrman's missing leg bone. I'll have more to say about this later, but for now I'll just say that I think that this is an absolutely brilliant idea, and the sort of connection that I never would have been able to make by myself. So thank you very much for that. On this subject of why Daughter Gascoigne went through the aqueduct, Dark Ideals argues that it's the only way into the chapel. Dima Parachute points out that she may very well have been following our scent. Something I hadn't thought of, but that is totally plausible, especially given how she points out that she recognized our scent. Adding to that, the bumbling mum pointed out that Annalise, the Queen of the Vilebloods, refers to us later in the game, if I recall correctly, as a moon-scented hunter. So very interesting indeed. Hinox Zitio writes that quite a few people believe that an angry mob killed Viola, and not Gascoigne himself. That could very well be true. Artificial Difficulty writes that he or she thinks that Gascoigne's possession of a resonant bell is a mere plot convenience. Quite possibly, but again, I think that in Dark Souls 1, they did a decent job of integrating the mechanics of White Soapstone into the plot. So it's possible that I'm not understanding how they did it here, but it seems that the mechanics of summoning and the Hunter's Dream, in general, are not as closely tied to the lore as they were in Dark Souls 1. Crow writes that Gascoigne and Alfred could very well have found the resonant bells in the Chalice dungeons themselves. That would actually make a lot of sense. It would date Gascoigne and Alfred to being rather elderly at this point, because if they had found them in the Chalice dungeons themselves, they would have had to have found them prior to the dream being conceived, because as far as I know, we don't find the Resonant Bell Factory in the Chalice dungeons. That is to say that the Resonant Bells have already been extracted from the Chalice dungeons by the time we get there, so they would have had to have had theirs a long time prior to that. But that still doesn't explain how it is that the player character multiverse of the Souls games works in this game. And maybe it is just a plot convenience, as Artificial Difficulty argued. On the subject of Yosefka's blood vial, both Kiran24 and Matthew Gets His point out that it actually looks a lot like plasma. And I must point out, I did not know that that's what plasma looked like, so I'm learning a lot from these comments. I should also point out that Redgrave posted a thread to Reddit about this topic and Yosefka more generally, which I will be covering in a future episode. The link, as always, can be found in the description. So we've gone over quite a fair bit in this episode, and I hope that I haven't overloaded you too much with my own academic musings, but I'm sure that you'll let me know in the comment section below whether or not this is something you want to see more of or less of going forward. I did want to give you a taste, as I mentioned, of why it is that I find the Souls game so interesting and how it is that I'm able to enrich my studies by playing the games and how my appreciation for the games is enriched by my studies. So in future episodes, I don't know if I'm going to go in as great depth as I did in this episode, linking the game with my studies, just because this episode took a lot of time to put together. And needless to say, that's more than I should be actually dedicating to something that isn't specifically focused on my work or my studies. So, but I guess at the end of the day, it depends on what each of you think. So I'm looking forward to hearing your feedback from this episode in particular. Thanks very much for your comments from the previous episode. Sorry to those of you to whom I could not get to your comments in this episode. I hope you understand that, my ability to squeeze them into the episode is rather limited, given that these episodes are long enough as they are. But thank you very much for watching, and I will see you in the next one. Bye-bye.
I must warn you not to go near the tomb below Erden Chapel in the Cathedral Ward. Henrik, an old hunter, has gone mad, and he's my mark.